From Beijing to Brussels and from Moscow to Mexico City, people around the world are also watching this U.S. presidential election with intense interest. There are many questions about the outcome and the impact on U.S. foreign policy.
We are going to win 4 more years in the White House.
If President Trump wins again, what will it mean for his increasingly turbulent relationship with China? Could we see progress on trade between the world's two largest economies, or would tensions continue to escalate? What if Joe Biden is the next U.S. president? Will he want to improve relations with Beijing? What sort of approach might he pursue with China's President Xi Jinping, the world leader Biden says he has spent more time with than any other? What about Trump's peacemaking efforts with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea? If Trump wins, can he build on his talks with Kim Jong-un and make progress towards denuclearization on the Korean peninsula? Would a President Biden take a more hardline approach with the DPRK leader?
It's great to be with you.
What's next for U.S. relations with Russia? Despite Western sanctions, Trump and Vladimir Putin have maintained a good rapport. But Joe Biden has signaled a tougher U.S. approach with Moscow if he's in the White House. And after almost 4 years of tensions between the Trump administration and Europe, would that worsen if Trump is re-elected? Can Biden revive relations between the longtime allies? What about NATO? Could the military alliance face further risks under a new Trump term? Or a revamp under Biden, who's touting his political experience? What about tensions with Iran, the climate crisis, ending U.S. wars? If it is President Trump again or President Biden, there are lots of questions. And to get some of those questions answered, joining us now from Beijing via Skype is Victor Gao. He is a Chinese international relations expert and commentator, and he is also chair professor at Soochow University. Joining us too from Moscow is Dmitry Babich. He is a journalist and analyst focusing on Russian politics. With us from North Carolina is Klaus Larres. He is a professor of history and international affairs, and he's a commentator on European politics. And joining us here in Washington, D.C. is John Sitilides. He is a geopolitical strategist and consultant to the U.S. State Department. Welcome to all of you to our special election coverage on the heat. Victor Gao, let's start in Beijing with China policy. If the polls are correct and Joe Biden does become president, he might find it very hard to undo some of the policies that have been put in place by Donald Trump. What would be the main priorities for China if Joe Biden becomes president?
I think China and the United States need to reset their hostile relations, and the relations have been poisoned by the Trump administration over the past 3 years and a half, because it is the right thing for the Chinese people and for the American people to re-engage with each other for their mutual benefit. The current hostility in the bilateral relations doesn't serve the fundamental interest of the American people or the Chinese people, and it's being poisoned by those people with a special agenda, which are against the fundamental interest of the American people.
So what would China do if if the new president is Biden?
I think China need to make it very well known to Washington under the new administration that the Chinese people and the American people should not be enemies with each other. And by mutually engaging with each other, we can create very much of benefit for both countries and for both people. I personally don't think the United States and China should be enemies against each other. We can get along with each other, whatever our differences, and it would take a lot of wisdom and courage and vision for leaders of both countries to overcome the differences and build up our common ground for our mutual benefit. So re-engagement, diplomacy, dialogue, mutual respect between the two countries will be utmost importance going forward.
All right, let's go to Moscow to Dmitry Babich. And Dmitry, over the past 4 years, Democrats have slammed Trump for his relationship with Vladimir Putin, even accusing Russia of interfering in the United States election. Joe Biden has already warned that if he becomes president, he will be much tougher on Russia. Let's listen to what he said.
I'll be a president who will stand with our allies and friends and make it clear to our adversaries the days of cozying up to dictators is over. Under President Biden, America will not turn a blind eye to Russian bounties on the heads of American soldiers.
Just to be clear, there is no evidence that Russia offered any kind of bounties for American soldiers. But Dmitry, how do you think Vladimir Putin would respond to a Biden presidency? What would it mean for Russia?
Well, first I would like to say that I agree with everything Victor has just said, and I'm absolutely sure I made dozens of interviews about it. 99% of the Russian elite would have the same words for the United States from the Russian side. We want to re-engage, and I would say that there was not a single sign of hostility from Russia. I've been covering international relations since 1989. It was under Gorbachev that the Russian elite basically made an attempt to engage with the West and to make Russia part of what used to be civilized world, which luckily has become much larger since 1989. But responding to your question, I'm very pessimistic about Joe Biden, because Trump was not good for Russia. He was never a buddy of Mr. Putin. That was just a big lie from the mainstream American media. And Trump's problem was that, you know, the ultra-liberal ideology which rules, in fact, the United States, never gave him much of power. Basically, if you look at all the summits between Putin and Trump, there was always this idiotic hysteria from the mainstream American media trying to see some kind of bromance or some kind of special friendship from Trump towards Putin. And that was just irresponsible behavior from the American media, because if you remember, since the beginning of the nuclear world and of the arms race, the whole world has been praying for good personal relations between the presidents of Russia and previously Soviet Union and the United States. And the world had all the reasons to pray for that, because we already have a lot of objective differences, and adding to that personal hostility would be wrong. But to my mind, Mr. Biden is just a man of the ultra-liberal ideology. He is a part of the same team of which Mr. Obama was a part and Mrs. Clinton was a part. And look, I mean, they blasted Trump all of these 4 years, but there's a strange phenomenon that few people pay attention to. Trump was the first president in 30 years who did not start another war. You know, a lot of so-called foreign policy professionals in the United States criticized Trump and dismissed him as unprofessional. But look, you know, Mr. Obama started the war in Libya. Basically, he supported the war in Syria, and he, I can say it from the position of knowledge, he basically started the confrontation in Ukraine by openly supporting an illegal coup in which 38 policemen were killed and the legally elected president was ousted.
Okay.
So I have no good predictions for Mr. Biden, but if Mr. Trump wins, I'm sure that the so-called Democrats will simply not concede a defeat. They will argue every inch of the territory. They will say that Trump did something wrong with the mail-in votes. So I expect this to be an election of Mr. Biden, not an election of two candidates running.
Okay, Klaus Larres, let's talk about the relationship between the United States and European countries. These relations have taken a hit during the Trump presidency. You will remember, of course, that Trump confronted European leaders over NATO contributions. So right now, what's the mood in European capitals?
Yeah, I agree that a reset with both China and Russia is utterly necessary, and I think it is also necessary to have a reset with Europe. And it would be much easier to have a reset with the European Union and the individual European countries, because there is a strong desire for American leadership still around in Europe. It has to be constructive, it has to be predictable and benign leadership, but the Europeans are actually quite happy with a good, constructive, predictable president who will take the leadership again, for example, in NATO. So if there were a President Biden, I'm sure he would be much more positive toward NATO, which would be much appreciated in Europe. He would also insist on higher defense contributions by the European NATO members, and I think they see that themselves, that they have to do something about that. President Biden would have less personal animosities with European leaders such as Angela Merkel. You know, Trump and Merkel are almost openly hostile relations, which is of course very poor and very bad, and that would not happen under President Biden. And I think also the trade relationship between the Europeans and the United States will become much, much better. Biden has already said that he will get rid of tariffs if at all possible, and that there's even talk around that a zero tariff trade relationship may be implemented between the Europeans and the United States. And then also I think what we recently saw, the inauguration of an EU-US dialogue on China, though that has been done yet now under the Trump administration, I can see that the Biden administration will continue that sort of dialogue, but perhaps make it more constructive, more predictable, and more constructive. So I'm actually quite positive that Biden will be very good for transatlantic relations.
John, President Trump has really transformed American foreign policy over the past 4 years. He's adopted the policy of America first. He's turned his back on globalization, really, and he's pulled out of a number of international agreements. If he's re-elected, is it going to be more of the same?
I don't see a reason why it wouldn't be more of the same if he believes that it's been a very successful foreign policy overall. And even if he's conducted himself in a very unorthodox and a very different manner, yes, I think this will be a large continuation, especially as it pertains to the U.S.-China relationship, which now involves a geopolitical competition not only in Asia, but on a global scale, and unfortunately a technological war that was probably launched by China's Made in China 2025 policy in 2015. As it pertains to Russia, it'll be very difficult to see how Joe Biden would have a tougher stance on Russia when it's been the Trump administration that's imposed sanctions on some of Vladimir Putin's top cronies. NATO is spending another $100 billion to rearm itself against the possible Russian threat. Energy prices have collapsed. It's done great damage to the Russian economy, and the Trump administration is providing arms to Ukraine. So I don't see what a tougher Biden policy there looks like. And as it pertains to Europe, there's going to be new German leadership. Chancellor Merkel, of course, is retiring from politics. But the Trump administration has had good relations with Paris, with London, with Warsaw, and a number of individual European countries. And U.S.-German relations can improve, but I think a lot of the steps need to be taken by Germany, especially weaning itself from greater dependence on Russian oil and natural gas.
Victor Garr, a few points I want to raise with you on what John said there. A technology war, do you see that take place between China and the United States? I mean, we just heard Chinese leaders at that plenary session in Beijing talk about more self-reliance. They don't want to depend on other countries, especially the United States, for technology.
Well, it is the Trump administration and his cohorts in Washington who raised the question of decoupling of China with the United States, which in itself is really indulging in fantasy. However, when Trump and his associates are constantly talking about decoupling and taking all the measures to whack at the kneecap of China in terms of Huawei, ZTE, TikTok, Tencent, you name it, it really raises alarm in China. It really destroys any confidence in the United States as a steady trading partner. So I think if there is any problem, it's created by Washington itself. It forces China onto a path of self-reliance because the United States is not to be trusted. It's not reliable as a trading partner. It's against globalization. It's against the market economy. It's against the economics 101, for example. Therefore, I think it will push China really onto more and more self-reliance, especially in terms of technological development.
Right.
And eventually, I think it will be bad for the United States to keep talking and practicing the so-called decoupling, because that will be against the fundamental interest of the American people.
Victor, very quickly, because I have a whole number of issues that I want to go through here, but could that change under a Biden presidency, or will we see the same kind of hostility between the two sides when it comes to technology?
Well, I hope the next president of the United States will be a man of decency who commands respectability in the world. And being tough on China should not be the real test. I think the real test should be whether being tough on China serves the fundamental interests of the American people. And I do believe President Biden will be a man of decency.
Yeah.
He can command respectability around the world, so he will be a good party to talk about and to negotiate about how to improve China-US relations, how to make sure that both the American people and the Chinese people will benefit from re-engagement with each other.
Dmitry Babich, if we look at Joe Biden, I mean, he's an old-school Washington insider. He's been in politics for almost 50 years. He's also served on the Foreign Relations Committee, so he is conversant with international relations. But when it comes to him being in the White House, it's expected that he will continue to support NATO, and he'll probably continue to support Western sanctions against Russia. But on the other hand, there are areas where the United States and Russia can cooperate, especially in the field of arms reduction, as well as strategic stability. Where do you see it going?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not as optimistic about Biden as John or Klaus, and with Victor, I would add that there is another irritant. First, I don't believe Biden will improve much of the economic relations between the United States and China, because, let me remind you, it was Mr. Obama who launched the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership Initiative, which did not include China and Russia. I mean, how can you build Trans-Pacific Partnership without including the two elephants in it, China and Russia? And that was when Mr. Biden was vice president. And of course, Mr. Biden will support the uprising in Hong Kong, which, unfortunately, all of the Western world supports for ideological reasons, I think disregarding the opinion of a lot of people in Hong Kong, probably the majority of Hong Kong's population. And the same policy, unfortunately, will be conducted most likely under Biden towards Russia. I mean, this is a policy based on ideology, not on facts. Even when John was speaking, he said about the Russian threat to Europe. Well, I mean, just look at the facts. Russian military budget is just 27% of the military budget of European NATO members. How can Russia attack, a military alliance which is many times stronger?
Yeah.
And it was not Russia that was expanding towards NATO. It was NATO that has been expanding since 1999 quite unnecessarily and disregarding the agreements reached before in the 90s,
right,
especially the Paris Agreement of 1997, which is almost dead now. So I expect a lot of dangerous policy from Biden, not because he is a bad man, but because he represents a very dangerous radical ideology.
All right.
And unfortunately, I don't expect him to take facts into account.
Mm-hmm. Klaus Larres, let's talk climate change. This is a big issue for the entire world. Dealing with the climate crisis is going to be critical for the world. On this issue, Trump and Biden have very different views. Let's listen to this exchange. It's from a recent debate between the two men. Let's watch.
The Paris Accord, I took us out because we were going to have to spend trillions of dollars, and we were treated very unfairly. When they put us in there, they did us a great disservice.
Climate change, climate warming, global warming is an existential threat to humanity. We have a moral obligation to deal with it.
So, Klaus, just on this issue, how will the outcome of the election really matter?
Oh, it will matter a lot. But may I just say something about Russia at first? I mean, a reset is required. I agree with that. But of course, Russia needs to bring something to the table. And it was, of course, Russia which annexed Crimea in 2014. It was Russia which semi-invaded eastern Ukraine and is still active in a foreign sovereign country which does not belong to Russia. So I think if President Putin was bringing something to the table and offering some new new constructive policy about, for example, the Ukraine issue, also the Crimea issue, then I think President Biden would be open to re-engage in a very constructive way with Russia, and that would be good for all of us.
Right,
I
Klaus,
fully agree.
What about the fact,
Yeah.
Klaus, that NATO did expand eastwards?
This is very true.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is very true, and that is a bone of a contention, and this may have been not the right policy, but that is now many years ago, and you cannot unexpand. This is not possible. Of course, the West is not innocent in having escalated difficult relations with Russia, but more recently, it really was the annexation of Crimea and the Ukraine military adventure by Russia. And the expansion of NATO can really not be compared with the annexation of territory and warfare. That is really on a different level. So I think the ball is here in Russia's court. And if they did something about Ukraine and Crimea, in particular about eastern Ukraine, I think a President Biden and possibly also a President Trump would be very open to a genuine reset.
Yeah. John, you know, as Dmitry pointed out, President Trump has not started a new war, and he says he wants to end America's wars. He's called them America's forever wars. But would a President Biden, who we know was a staunch supporter of the war in Iraq, but would he want to insert the United States into Syria, perhaps continue the war in Afghanistan, and engage in other kinds of military actions in the Middle East?
Well, it's tough to anticipate what kind of crises may unfold over the next 4 years and what exactly a President Biden would do. But if we do look at his track record, remember it was the Obama-Biden presidency that joined with NATO to oust the regime of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and bring about an area of ungoverned chaos in northern Africa that has now directly impacted Europe with the increased flow of migrants across the Mediterranean Sea. And now you have proxy wars with Russia and France on one side, Italy, Turkey, and Qatar on the other, and possibly bringing in the Egyptian military. So we don't know what a Biden presidency would do if, say, Libya blows out of control. So it's difficult to predict, but the track record is clearly one in favor of more robust military intervention abroad. And President Trump is telling his voters, or has been telling his voters, that he promised to withdraw, no more wars, and his campaign has been one of promises kept.
Victor Gao, what about the issue of denuclearization and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea? Joe Biden could take a much harder line against Kim Jong-un than President Trump. But regardless of who wins, do you see the United States playing any kind of constructive role on getting rid of nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula, or could we have a President Biden provoke a confrontation?
Well, I think denuclearization on the Korean peninsula should be the top priority going forward over the coming 4 years. But it will take a lot of wisdom and good strategy for the United States, for countries like China, Russia, etc., to be all involved and to create enough incentive for the DPRK government to eventually and finally give up the nuclear weapons in their possession in exchange for assurances for their security and for the survivability of their regime. It's not child's play, it's not wishful thinking, it's not what President Trump demonstrated in a very childish manner, as if pure talk can convince the DPRK to give up its nuclear weapon, because he simply doesn't know the reason behind why DPRK is in possession of nuclear weapons and why it is further enhancing the capability of nuclear weaponry in DPRK. So I hope the new administration in the United States will be more sophisticated, will really be a team player rather than going solo in believing that they can achieve denuclearization on the Korean peninsula.
Dmitry Babich, let's talk Iran. President Trump, of course, pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, and we still have tensions running high after the killing of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. There were even fears of war at that stage. Where do you see this relationship going should Biden become president?
Well, I hope that Biden would not repeat the terrible actions of Mr. Trump. I mean, killing a general of a sovereign country on the territory of another country is just irresponsible, and it set a very bad precedent. But we really don't know, because Mr. Biden, I mean, Klaus, I've been born in Ukraine, and I lived in Crimea for many years. You don't know what you're talking about when you say that Russia annexed Crimea. Crimea became a part of Russian Empire in 1785, and it was given to Ukraine by Nikita Khrushchev in 1954. And Crimeans always considered themselves to be Russians. The problem was that when Ukraine became independent in 1991, they expected relations between Ukraine and Russia to be normal. And they tolerated pressure from Kiev until 2015, when Mr. Biden became a kind of a viceroy of the United States in Crimea and made Ukraine, together with the regime ruling there, a very hostile country for Russia, a country that was hostile to Russia.
Okay.
So, speaking from the position of no, and I will finish. It's very important.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the example of Biden's actions in Ukraine is very bad. So I don't expect Mr. Biden to be a peacemaker in Iran neither.
Yeah, I mean, the whole world has condemned the annexation of Crimea. Russia was thrown out of the G8, which is now the G7, because of that occasion. The United Nations has condemned Russia, as well as the invasion or semi-invasion of eastern Ukraine. So it's not a point of view which only I represent. The whole world represents this view. Can I also say that regarding domestic American politics, Biden may actually be fortunate that a vaccine will be developed and that people would be able to take it, and that of course means another lockdown will not be necessary. The American economy will recover very soon. So hopefully that that fortunate turn of having a vaccine available will be with us early next year.
That's right. We did hear some promising news about a vaccine. Victor Garve, we've got less than a minute left. If economic forecasts are any barometer, then the Chinese economy will continue to grow, and China could possibly have an even bigger role on the world stage when it comes to trade and economic relations. Could this drive us into an era of even more confrontation between China and the United States?
Well, no, I don't think so. I think the year-end number for 2020 will indicate that Chinese economy will be about 70%, if not larger, than that of the United States. And the Chinese growth will be more robust and more sustainable than that of the United States. I'm confident about the medium and the longer-term relations between China and the United States, mainly because the Chinese people and the American people should not be enemies with each other. We should find a way to get along. And the larger Chinese economy should not be a threat to the United States. It should create more opportunities for the United States and better for more jobs in the United States.
And that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. It was a great discussion. That's it for this edition of The Heat. CGTN special election coverage continues right now.